Thank you all for coming. This is a very special time. We are the Erev Rosh Chodesh, the eve of the beginning of the month of Adar. Mishenichnas Adar marbim besimcha. The Rabbi tells us when we have these beautiful months of Adar, we should increase happiness. The question is, when we are about to study the Megillah, the ganze Megillah, the book of Esther, in some ways it's like the chaos theory. How many of you heard that 22 years old chaos theory?
No.
Yes? Yes?
No.
Yes?
No.
No? Yes?
No.
Okay. Chaos theory, in very, very short, is the theory that you, in a way, imagine that you are like a butterfly or one of those fly, and imagine that it's only, like 3 days. The most of them lives about 3 days, and you imagine like you are in a fantasy, in a beautiful world, and you want to be, let's say, in Australia. And all of a sudden you open your eyes and you are in the midst of a terrible tornado, hurricane, fire, wildfire, and crazy things. And it's a total contradiction between two things, that one doesn't make sense, the other. So with that, it's a theory. I try to examine the modern science in conjunction to the contradictions that we have in the modern world. All this theory that the science gives us, in a way, contradicts the total chaos world that we are living. And I do not need to elaborate, especially current events, with those who are exposed to the news, with the virus, the coronavirus, and more. In the book of Esther, if we examine the book with all honesty, and today we're going to deal with a little higher level than the way we learn in the kindergarten, and the elementary school, and even a high school. It's a total different approach as this group as a mature adult, how the chaos, the idea of Esther, which the rabbi said it's not just Esther, it's also Hester. Hester meaning a hidden message, is something that we do not see how God is there. The Vilna Gaon said that every time they use the word Hamelech, the king, it's implication of God, that obviously God is there, but God is hiding the face. You don't see God, it's like hidden there in between. How a person like Esther, if we try to examine it's a mature adult, a person who's born to a certain situation, is that predestined or set up to be the redeemer or the queen of Israel that saved the lives of so many Jews around the world, and how a person who is born to a crisis, to a situation of being childless from father and mother, as the Megillah tells us, goes to adoption by a relative, then married to that relative, and from that point turn against her will to be the queen, and how the Jewish people at that time, from being about to be executed and about to be murdered by many, turns to be the one who's control the country and the situation. So the dynamic here to the extremes, and if you want to wrap it honestly, it's the very, very sad story. It's a tragedy, the book of Esther, that ends up with like American movies, with a happy ending. But it's a tragedy. The idea that Mordechai approached her and said to her, Mi yodea, who knows if the whole purpose of you born and raised by me and get there and being in the palace, im le'et kazot egat malchut, that the whole purpose of the Almighty, the destiny that you destined in this life, it's to be there. There is a book called Maybe, the whole theory of maybe, the whole life we should approach sometimes with maybe. But it's in a way a chaos theory. You know why? Because let's talk simple. God forbid someone born without hand, right? Or lost hands. Obviously, we all know in the modern days that doesn't mean that he or she have children without hands, God forbid. It's one has nothing to do with the other, right? So the question is, it was a predestined plan from God to have it all set up in a certain way, in a hester, in a hidden way, or it's something else. Because when we examine and we even try to juxtapose the story of Dinah, the rape of Dinah in the book of Genesis, the book of Bereshit, how she was one of those biblical horrific story of rape, and we in the modern halakha, the modern Jewish law, try to resonate or try to understand that voice of women that go through this traumatic rape experience or traumatic event. They not just the experience, but it's called in halakha be'ilah shelo be'askama, that having some type of rape without the consent of the victim, right? So this is something that we need to examine. So if you look at the entire book of Esther, she is total silence from the beginning, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, up to chapter 4. She has zero say, she has no voice, she has nothing. And then there is a really heartbreaking line that said, "Vatilakach Esther." Vatilakach Esther, meaning it was a situation that all the women get together in order to be examined by the king Ahasuerus. And again, it's hard for us to comprehend how the world of Persia 2300 years ago operated. But the text tells us, "Ubehikavetz betulot shnei nitz." They get together, all these women, and they have, again, it's hard for us in the 21st century to understand the status or the feeling of those women, that basically you can argue and say that it's a big honor to be with the king even for one night, or you say that it's a horrible experience. How exactly they take it? Apparently it was something that those women compete to be with the king. Or you can go the other way, the biblical language, they use the word vatilakach. When they use the word vatilakach, lekicha, right? Taken.
Yeah.
So in a biblical term, we learn that in Parashat Kitayitze, for example, ki yikach ish isha. When a husband, sorry all these ladies, you should forgive me, it's not me, but the biblical term, they use the word acquire when it speaks about husband and wife. They said, ki yikach ish isha, when a husband, in the biblical terms, acquires wife. So in the biblical mindset, it means that in order for a man to have a wife, he needs to acquire in the Talmudic language, it means he needs to pay, he needs to give ketubah, which is rabbinic, he needs to go through a certain process to have her his. So in that mindset, which again, it's hard for us to get to that ancient mindset, but to get the concept, Esther was taken, vatilakach Esther. And the big question is that totally against her will? Or she consent, or she feels comfortable to be part of that scenes, to be able to be with the king and more. So as we said, up to chapter 4, it's a mind-boggling situation. It's a very hard for us to understand what Esther and what the mindset of the Megillah, wow, and how things transpire.
So
furthermore,
yes, one thing I was saying, I know where you talked about the acquiring a wife, and it's kind of hard for us to understand that concept but really, if you think about it, there are vestiges of it even now in the secular. I mean, most of the time, vast majority of the time, it's a man that gives the woman the engagement ring.
Okay.
They give something of value to the woman, and it's not generally not the other way. So I'm not saying, but I'm just saying there's still vestiges of it from how it was in the past, right?
That's good, but remember the language here, that Esther has no voice. You don't see that if she runs to be with the king, or she really dying to be part of that competition. You don't see it. furthermore, if you read the first chapter, the story of Vashti, especially if you use rabbinic interpretation, because we said it many, many times, do not even try to study Tanakh independently. This is a formulation for crisis. If you start study Tanakh, the 24 books of the Tanakh by yourself, without a broker, without a rabbi, a teacher, or someone who's erudite and familiar with all the writing, you can easily misconstrue the text. So if you go by the rabbinic interpretation of story of Vashti, it's a different form of rape. You know, he asked her to come naked, and it's all the way that eventually he gets rid of her. It's a very, to say the least, a different atmosphere that we expose in the modern day. Another something to think before we go to the text is by the end of the Megillah is a happy ending. In a way, we all celebrating, right? We celebrating Revach ve'Atzala, that we saved, and we have these Homentashen and grovels and the customs and this big celebration of Purim. Yet, if you examine Esther, she ends up in this crazy king or wicked king or whatever you determine Achashverosh in his palace for the rest of her life. So in that sense, the moment she changed her status from Hadassah, it's like, in a sense, it's like a regular husband-wife or regular Jewish woman status, to be part of the king world, of the ostentatious palace, and living in the intimate world of Mordechai and the house that she was for her short lives to the time of being the queen. It's all something that it's totally new for her, and something that it's problematic, at least from the rabbinic perspective. So I think one of the good source for us is people who are, I'm talking to a crowd who's educated, and many of you read the Megillah more time than I have a chance to read. There is a Gemara, is a Talmudic text in Tractate Sanhedrin, that dealing with the law called Yehareg ve'al ya'avor. Yehareg ve'al ya'avor is a very interesting rabbinic concept based on the biblical term that said that certain commandments we are commanded not to violate. And we do our best not to violate those commandments. But there are only 3 commandments that the rabbi said you better die and not do that. And who are they? First one is Avodah Zarah. If they ask you to idol worship, so by the dry term of halakha, of Jewish law, it's better for a person to die and not to idol worship, which is at the beginning of the 10 Commandments. Second one is Gilui Arayot. Gilui Arayot meaning having illicit relations. And the third one is Shfichut Damim, causing death to someone else. So basically these 3, the rabbis unanimously are very strong in the view that one should rather die by the enemy and not violate one of the 3. Now, the other side, the rabbi said in Leviticus, the Torah tells us, V'chai bahem, that one should live. When we returned the Torah to the Ark, we said the Torah is the blueprint of life. We should live in the Torah. So therefore, we need to make the accommodation in a sense of current life in 21st century with our value of Torah. So I just give you the paraphrase, the key idea from the Talmudic text. Rav Dimi bar Ravin, was a rabbi by that name, said, Lo shanu ela bishat hashmad. If it's a time of great crisis, the whole world is against us, and they tell us, here you choice, either to convert or either to follow our rules, or we're going to kill you. So therefore, it's a different story. But if it's a regular time, meaning it's not a time of great crisis, a person should die, Yehareg ve'al ya'avor. The person should die and not violate any one of these 3 strong commandments. Some we have time, we mentioned, if you remember, at Hanukkah, the book of Maccabees. And over there is a story of Hannah and the 7 sons and how she went through, etc. So the rabbis expand on that. And they said, we have to differentiate between parhesia meaning when one does this in public, versus if a person does a violation, he or she, in private. So the Gemara asks, Befarhesia beha Esther, how do you explain the story of Esther? What does that mean? Here, Esther entered to the new world of rabbinic discussions, which is practical Jewish law. They ask a question, she basically living with a foreign king, with a king that everyone knows, Beparesia, everyone knows about what's going on, right? And she is obviously sleeping with the king and being part of that. Is that not a violation of Gilui Arayot, one of the 3 strong commandments that one should die and not violate that commandments? So with that subject, it's another painful subject. Mordechai. Who is Mordechai? So obviously we remember what we learned in our nursery school, in our preschool, and elementary school, and some of us dress like Mordechai, right? With a long beard and payas and shtreimel and gartel and look like a centaur, whatever it is, ancient, very religious man. Even he was Persian, right? So he was Chassid, even he was Persian, right? Sephardic Chassid, that's right. So the text said that Mordechai took Esther, lakach lo lebat. He took her as his daughter. And with that, the rabbis have 2 views what exactly transpired between Mordechai and Esther. One view said that he was her uncle, and he adopted her. Since she lost her parents in a very young age, he adopted her. There is another view of our rabbis that said that he married her. So think together with me. If you tell me, right, this is a very intelligent crowd. So think, if you tell me that Mordechai married Esther, either early part he adopted her, but then he married her, so she is basically mekudeshet. You know, under the chuppah, the husband said to the wife, Hareya mekudeshetli, you are consecrated to me, you are sanctified to me, kedat Moshe Weisblum, right? That's part of what we said under the chuppah. So, again, if you just study it without Chazal, without our rabbis, it's very hard to understand what exactly happened. I think, in just a side note, that this is something fascinating that put a big mechanism between Judaism and many other faith groups. Because if you go by the Islam, for example, it's a very strong prohibition for lay people to study the text without a mentor. Because you can easily misconstrue and be, God forbid, heretic if you study the holy text by yourself. You see it also in Catholicism. You see it in Hinduism and Confucianism and many other religions that they have dogma. They requested, the big fight in every religious group is who has the right of interpretation. But obviously, people go for many years. It's a matter of fact that in Japan, right, their religion, right, some of the priests go for 10 years training, just the interpretation of text. So no comparison, right? But in Jewish faith, we need to have some tools, some teachers to explain what's going on. In the elementary school, we learn, like you see in the art school children Megillah, that Mordechai adopted Esther, and she was like adopted daughter. Very nice fairy tale for kids, right? But if you go by the Talmud, and it's a discussion, they say that it's a view that they married. Mordechai married her. So now the Talmud said something, a line that it's, again, mind-boggling line. They said that Esther yotzet mechiko shel Achashverosh. She was playing with Achashverosh, the Persian king, and then she goes to duck herself in a ritual bath and go back to her husband Mordechai, and vice versa. The Talmud tells us. So if you try to analyze the life of Esther, it's really life of tragedy, life of crisis. She's in jail, but nice jail, right? She's in a palace with all the beauty, but at least on the surface, very unhappy lives, you know. She have a Jewish husband, and she have this king, right? So here is part of the Talmudic tractate Megillah. It's a tractate that almost totally dedicated to the story of the Megillah, the scroll of Esther. And they describe Esther as a person with a two different worlds, in a total torn lives. In one hand, she is in the world of Yiddishkeit, the world of Torah, the world of Mordechai. And by the same time, she's in the world of Achashverosh in the palace. Was a great rabbi in the Talmud, who also unfortunately was orphaned at a very young age. His name is Abaye. Asher Becha Yerucham Yatom, that he was born and he lost his parents at a very early stage. His father died during the pregnancy and his mother died while she delivered him. So he lived in the ancient Aramaic city, it's called Pumpedita. And Abaye tried to bring interpretation to the story of Esther. Very hard to hear, but I'm just quoting or paraphrasing what the Abaye interpretation to this. And he said, in one hand, we know that Esther, quote unquote, belongs to Mordechai. And he asked, Veha Esther beparesia, meaning in public, everyone knows that as a married woman, she goes and she lives with the king. And he answered, he said, Esther karka olam haita. Esther was an estate, world estate. What does that mean? Hard to understand what you mean by that. This is a rough statement, but in our simple language, she was a passive character. Horrible, but that's the way he interpreted the text. Which means, in a Talmudic mindset, the same way as they call Karka Olam, estate, if you have a land, and the land has a plan, right? And you put a plan, and then you have a rain, and all of a sudden you have something that's coming out of the rain, right? So that estate, it's estate. It belongs in that sense. If it's an empty spot, it's almost like we said it's a government or it's a people estate, right? So he held that she was in a sense of submissiveness or living with life of crisis and everything. She was passive, total passive. And soon you see what's the difference if a person is passive. When I read that Abaye statement, it reminds me a Viktor Frankl, Professor Viktor Frankl book, which I'm sure you're familiar, A Man in Search of Meaning. Viktor Frankl, at the 60s, was a well-known psychiatrist and neuropsychiatrist, and he was specialized in the human brain and understanding human brain. So one of his writings was about the Holocaust he experienced as a Jew being in a concentration camp. And they asked him, how do you survive? And he said, in my psyche, in my mindset, I wasn't there. I was psychologically departed from that crisis, from the concentration camp, and I was in a different planet. I wasn't there. Physically, you can argue I was there, but mentally I wasn't there. So in that sense, we try to understand what Abaye tells us. He tells us that Esther was kind of forced to be with Achashverosh, and therefore that relation involved with total being total passive, which means it's horrible. It's very hard to describe, but it's like no emotion, it's total coldness. It's like he used the term karka olam. It's like estate. Rava disagreed with Abaye. You know, in the Talmud, it's always two views. Rava, another great rabbi, he disagreed. And he said, even you tell me that it's a case of rape, you can argue, and he said that the king, Achashverosh, have relation with her, not because he wants her to change her religion, to convert or do something against her faith. He did it for his pleasure. So the moment he did it for his pleasure, here you enter a disputation between Abaye and Rava. One said that she is total innocent, she is a passive character who's not involved with anything. And or you can argue and say that the king did not have such a transgression that is under the category of you should die and not to violate, because the whole purpose of the king is just to have fun, to have pleasure, and nothing more. Now, in the retrospect, we very much venerating Esther, right? We look at her as our Mashiach, as our Redeemer in some ways. The name of book after her, and we know that she's a crucial part of our not only history, but even to these current events. Some rabbis' rules based on the study of this book. But at the 11th century, it was in Europe, a group of rabbis, they call them Baalei HaTosfot, the rabbis that comments on the Talmud. One of them was a grandson of Rashi, his name is Rabbeinu Tam, and others that comments on the Talmudic text. And the Tosfot ask a question, is that under the category of Gilui Arayot? The whole story is under the category of a person should die and not violate the law. Why? Because they said, Mishum de lo mihatnei ba'avera, because she is not having any pleasure for being part of that situation, so therefore she's not partner of that crime, she's not partner of that sin. So Tosfot argue, and he asked, what is your mindset when it's come to this relation, husband-wife relation, in conjunction to a pleasure or not having pleasure? You have to tell me simply by a dry law if she was partner in the crime or not partner in the crime. And furthermore, the argument said it can be that she have no pleasure for all that stuff. Tosfot view. Again, you have to remember, Tosfot, it's 11th century, many years ago. When you read that, at least I can say that I appreciate the life of 21st century in United States versus the character you try to understand how they're thinking, even at the 11th century. Is a Israeli professor, a secular professor. Her name is Shulamit Shachar. She wrote extensively about women and women's rights. So one of them, it's not about Jewish faith per se, but just the life of women of the Middle Ages era, particularly that time, 11th, 12th century. If you read that, you really appreciate the world of the 21st century, because at that time, women is not just have no rights. They are right. It's total submissiveness. It's life of crisis. So Tosfot asked further and said, wait a second, what Esther's mindset? Why she did it? Is she did it because she want to save herself? Or, you go by Rabbeinu Tam, the grandson of Rashi, he has all this mindset that relation with a non-Jew carries a different category in Jewish law versus relation with Jew, and those who wants to read the Rabbeinu Tam is a mind-boggling Rabbeinu Tam. Obviously we have a derivative from someone who sleep with a non-Jew and then they have a baby and is a process of conversion. That person turned later on to be Jewish, the status of the child, the pregnancy and more. But back to our question, why did Esther did not die and not go into that experience of being against her will with the king? So the Talmud said, when Esther asked them, you see on chapter 4, she asked them to take a journey of what? Of 3 days of fasting. She asked everyone to fast for 3 days. And she said, Gam ani v'na'arotai, I also going to fast as you. And therefore, it's page 37. And she said, you should fast for 3 days, and I will fast with my, all the people around her, the servants also. And then she said, after that, ובכן אבוא אל המלך אשר לא כדת, this is verse 16, and then I'll go to the king even though it's against the law. What does that mean, against the law? So Rabbi Abba said in the Talmud, עד עכשיו באונס, up to this point, I was there against my will. Now things change. Now you ask me, Mordechai asked her to do what? To go and initiate a meeting with the king. So it means, וכאשר עבדתי, עבדתי. If I die, then I will die. Meaning, up to this point, I'm in a state. I'm karka olam. I'm nothing. Now I'm proactive. Now you ask me to actively go to the king and ask. It reminds me the story of the Moranos. I'm sure that many of you are familiar. The Moranos are the Jews that lived during the era of crisis, particularly 15th century in Spain, Portugal, Italy, and other places in Europe.
And Mexico.
Holland. And they some of them decided to pretend to be Christian, while they observed Judaism in secret. Some of them were caught, the Inquisition killed them in public, etc., etc. Later on, when those Moranos move on and life change, and they are part of a Persian community, they are part of a Amsterdam Jewish Dutch community and more, the communities that were there refused to accept them. One of their claims, as Rabbi Sasportas, the chief rabbi of Holland, wrote in his diary, and others, look, these people did not stand with Judaism at the time of crisis, so therefore we cannot accept them and marry them and have them part of our community as everyone else. You can argue, but I'm just telling you, to this very day, by the way, some Persian Jews look down at other Persian Jews. They have different communities. There is a community from Shiraz, there's a community from Asfam, and there's a community from Tehran. I don't want to tell you what and where, but one of their communities is considering a former Moranos, and they do not marry them, right? Even they are Jews. So anyway,
even the children.
Even the children. Descendants.
So they, yeah, right.
So the question is, what do you mean by saying, if I die, then I will die? You can go by the mindset of the Hasidic teaching, that's saying, I'm going to devote my life for Judaism. I'm going to kill myself to save the Jewish people. Right? So I'm going to suffering, to Gehinnom, to hell, but I'm going to save my people. Why? Because I'm going to the king, and it's against the law, and he must probably get rid of me, and who knows how he tortured me before that, and who knows what he's going to do to me. But I'll do that if that's going to save the people, or I'll be the emissary to save the people. I'm willing to do that. That's one way to look, as some rabbis give us in their beautiful talk. That's called Mesirut Nefesh. But I can tell you, when I have the privilege to read the Megillah, I always have a goosebump when I read this line. I try to get the mindset of Esther. Look at this verse 16. Lech knos et kol hayudim. She said to Mordechai, she sent someone, and she says, go and gather together all the Jewish people of Shushan. And guess what? Excuse me. And I ask you to do what? Not to fast, not to drink, not to eat. Very hard. For how long? This is hot weather, Persia, right? 3 days and 3 days and 3 nights, the entire Jewish world. And according to our sources, That fast took place on Pesach. This is the only time in Jewish history the Jewish people fast on Yom Tov Pesach for 3 days and 3 nights. The whole story of Megillah was 11 months later, but the fast took place at that time on Pesach. So she asked Mordechai to ask the entire Jewish world to fast for 3 days and 3 nights. Imagine. And then she said, I'm going to do the same. And after that, commitment from every single Jew around the world that the question of their life-saving situation, because the decree to physically annihilate all the Jews worldwide, then and only then, uvchen, and then I'm going to do that. I'm going to follow your command. I'm going, because she refused at the beginning, right? And Mordechai pushed her, and said to her, that's the whole destiny, that's the whole purpose of you being there. And then I'm going to die, or I'm going to approach the king, whatever it is, and the end is so painful. She said, V'cha'asher avadati, and if I'll perish, avadati, I'll perish. So the rabbis argue in more current rabbinic responsa over this. I'm giving you 2 responses. It's a food for thought, very painful. I'm just paraphrase those responses. One is the 15th century from a great rabbi in Germany. His name is Maharik, or in not abbreviated, is Rabbi Yosef Kulon. In chapter Siman Kuf Samech Zayin 167 is a full responsa over this, and was based on question that people asked him, and he said Esther did not violate any rules. She didn't do any violations. She was total righteous woman. And he said, furthermore, she did a great mitzvah that she saved the whole Jewish world. And furthermore, he says that the divine providence, it's called Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, or whatever you translated, it was upon her, because they said in the chapter 5, the beginning, Vatilbash Esther Malchut, Esther dressed in her royal clothing. So the rabbi said that this is not a literal understanding, it's more spiritual or mystical understanding. The rabbi said that there are 7 prophetesses, 7 women in the Bible, that there are women prophetesses, right? And she is one of them. Esther was one of them. So therefore, we said that when she decided to do it and go to Achashverosh, but now she's not passive, she's proactive, so he said, Mikuach ze ne'esra al Mordechai. So from this point onward, she is prohibited to her husband Mordechai. So listen to this predicament, to this heartbreaking dilemma. In one hand, what you tell me, that she is the most righteous woman ever, right? One of the 7 prophetesses and the savior, the Mashiach, right? The savior of the Jewish people. Yet, since from now on she's proactive with the king, with the wicked king, she cannot go back and have relation with her husband. So even it's simply said that she did a great mitzvah, but he brought example of Yael. You're familiar with the book of Judges? It's a story of Yael. It was an evil man by the name of Sisera, tried to get rid of her.
That was the long Haftorah, right?
Right? So Yael, what did she do? She cut off his head while she gave him something to drink, cheese, milk, whatever you said, wine, whatever it is.
Milk, and he slept. He had a nice sleep.
Fell asleep.
Absolutely.
Fell asleep,
It's a warm cup of milk.
She
Nice.
took a tent peg and a hammer and she smacked it through his head while he was laying there on the ground.
Thank you for those details.
Right?
It's a long Haftorah.
You are very
Many
graphic. So,
times.
very graphic. But anyway, we talk about Mesirut Nefesh. We talk about devotion of life. Esther said, and if I'll perish, right? So, in one hand, you said that the Almighty have a great joy in that sense, that she's devoted herself for the Jewish community. On the other hand, is a problem for her to go back to her husband. Is she allowed to go back to her husband? Why? Because there is a concept in halacha, it's called avera lishma. You're doing a sin with the knowledge that you are doing a sin, but you're doing that sin in order to do a great mitzvah. It sounds like chunks on Shabbos, right, David? You're eating chunks on Shabbos?
Yeah.
Good. So that's the
You have the
story
other bigger books?
over there.
They're up there, right?
So what is that story? For example, we read the I assume you know the story of Tisha B'Av, when the Caesar sent the blemish animal. It was a rabbi by the name of Zechariah ben Avkulas who said, no, blemish animal cannot be offered in the temple. And because of that, they burned the temple and executed our people. Which in a way, in a retrospect, if we allow that to happen, we may have the temple. So here's a question that is a very serious, painful question. If you tell me that she have a double relationships, she have Achashverosh, and then she go back to her husband, and in a way they don't know that she's Jewish, as the text said, right, at the early part. So how exactly that reconciled with the issue of now she's proactive? Furthermore, there is another response, and we're getting close to our days. 18th century, it was a rabbi again in Germany by the name of Rabbi Yaakov Mereisha. That's his name. He wrote a book called Shvut Yaakov. It's a responsa, rabbinic responsa. And in that book, he described a real story, real unbelievable, painful story. Again, we need to go back to 18th century mindset. Horses, wagons, people travel a long time from city to city for business. It was a group of men with a lot of money. They travel from one location to another, and they stop in that small inn. One of the men has his wife with him. And all of a sudden, robbers came in, 3 robbers. And they want to rob to take all the money. So the married woman, the wife of one of the men, volunteered to be with those robbers. And while she was with them, apparently, at least the way we understand the story, they have a chance to call the authority, etc., etc. They caught them, and eventually the money was saved and these people were saved. The question is she allowed now to be back with her husband? Why? Because it's not the regular case of a rape. A rape by Jewish law, you said that if a woman is raped in any form, we're not talking about priests, Kohanim, we talk general, right? She was raped, she can be back with her husband if it was against her will. But if she proactively, the husband initiated or she initiated that type of relations, even they save the people, they save those people's either money or lives, whatever it is, the question is, how are you treated now? We have another painful story, which obviously we don't have the time. By the end of book of Judges, there is a story of Pilegesh Bagiv'ah, the concubine with cutting the body to 12 pieces. Horrible.
We were talking about that on Shabbos. It's
That was
horrible episode.
Right. Horrible story. So again, we are back to a painful story of Esther. We said at the beginning that the chaos theory. Chaos theory said that with all the balagan, with all the chaos, there is a divine plan. There is a purpose for all of that. So what exactly the purpose of all that Esther, that hidden story that we transpired? So obviously you can take it to many directions. But before we read the text, let's take a little break.